What's up guys, it's CG here, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the meta because of course with a new ban list means that we're going to have a new format and we need to take a look at exactly what decks are going to become the best decks, because I know that a lot of things are not going to change particularly just because there aren't a lot of new decks right now, maybe new engines that you can use in your decks, but I think that this ban list actually did a really good job at making things more even, just because this is a thing that when we're playing in good formats, which you cannot argue that the last format was actually a really good format, it did have a few problems that need to be addressed, but I think Konami did a really good job of solving most of those problems, because we know that some stuff that needed to get hit did not get hit, but it's mainly because of marketing things and that Konami wants to sell more stuff. But still, this I think is going to be an even better format than the last one, and these are the top 10 decks that you should be looking out for the most, just because these are the ones that were performing best during the previous format, and now that either they have new stuff got back from the ban list, or maybe other decks that got hit that are not longer in the best decks, because let's be real, some decks got hit really hard in this ban list because you know that a lot of cards that maybe did not deserve to get hit got hit, but we're going to mention all those decks that you're going to face in the format. So without further ado, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the list. Number 10, Sky Striker. Sky Striker players can finally rejoice. Imperial Order is banned and there is not a single card that you left in the game that can basically outright destroy your entire strategy. So Sky Strikers, even though they did lose a copy of Fusion Destiny, which can hurt a lot because Striker was one of those decks that tried to not summon Anaconda but mostly hard draw the Fusion Destiny to make the plays better, because summoning Anaconda means that you're not going to be able to get a Shizuku search during the end phase. But still, I don't think it's going to matter too much, just because it mainly gained more by not being able to get countered as easily as before because of a card like Imperial Order. So I think Sky Strikers at the right hands can actually do a lot, because the thing with this deck is that it needs a dedicated fund base, a really good pilots in order to function, because it's not one of those decks that new players or returning players can actually just pick up right away and they can do well like any other deck that you're going to see in this list. No, this deck actually requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of matchup knowledge, which I think is more important than actual deck knowledge. So I think this deck just makes it so that you get more rewarded when you actually learn how to play, which is why I'm putting it at 10, because you don't see it as often as you should, depending on how good the pilot is. But still, this deck, you can actually do so much with it, and I think it has a really good matchup with most of those decks here, just because it's so versatile in the tools that it has. Number 9, Dragon Link. Now, dragons, they're always going to be in the format. It just seems like every time Konami hits this deck, it just doesn't die. And because LP got banned, and it changed a lot, but it didn't change as much as it should have. So you're going to keep seeing this deck. And the thing about Dragon Link is that it has always been this deck that it has crawling in the darkness, and then when a banlist comes out and they hit most of the actual good decks, then you actually see Dragon Link making a resurgence. Is this what you're going to see again? Because I'm pretty sure that eventually we're going to reach a format where Dragon Link is once again the best deck, because Konami will not hit it anytime soon, but they might be forced to hit it eventually if this keeps happening, because this is the story of Dragon Link pretty much. So yep, you're going to see it again, and I'm putting it at 9 for now, but you're going to see it get higher up eventually, because this is one of those decks that people already know exactly what this deck is about. It's been around too long, so they know exactly what they need to do with it in order to make it work. So yeah, it's a deck that a lot of people just go back for comfort, and it's a deck that actually can do so much. Number 8, Virtual World. Now, some decks in this list actually got more of a nerf than a buff, even if they got cards banned, mainly because of Desires going to 1. Now, I know that Desires going to 1 makes it so that you go more for Prosperity route, but the thing about Prosperity is that not a lot of people can afford it, and not many people are willing to afford it, especially if we're not talking about the highest level of events. The thing about Virtual World is that it did get back one more emergency teleport, which is good, but losing 2 copies of Desires and getting back 1 teleport, I wouldn't exactly call this a buff for the deck. So this is why I think this deck, if you don't choose to play Prosperity and you just play 1 copy of Desires, then it can be kinda slightly worse than it was in the previous form. But Virtual World is a deck that it doesn't really need the draw power in order to do what it does. It's a deck that, as long as it has all of its tools, it can make a really big board. All of its cards are considered extenders, so the deck is very resilient to any kind of interruption your opponent has, even going second. So I think this deck, if it didn't have those sometimes consistency issues, it would have been much higher on the list, but I still think this deck is really good, and maybe can incorporate other stuff as well in the deck to make it work. I've seen some Sword Soul Virtual World decks that actually make sense because they're weird monsters. So I think this deck, it can be experimented with, it can be really good under the right circumstances, and it's a deck that the combo that it does, it can basically win you most of your matchups. You cannot win against control type based decks, but it does have tools to deal with control decks as well, in form of the continuous drop card. So I think this deck can actually do a lot, and just people enjoy playing this deck because it's so budget. But again, if you have to play Prosperity now with only 1 Desires, it's not as budget as it used to be, but I don't think a lot of people will choose to do that. They're just going to play with what they have. Number 7, Flanders. Now, this deck just got the new support that we've been waiting for, and this is why, even though we haven't been seeing this deck for the past few months, Now with a new card, the consistency is just off the roof. And this deck is basically like a New Age Monarch and True Draco deck combined. So you can do so much with this deck. Against Link decks, this deck is absolutely impossible to lose. So because of the effect of your M-Pen, so you can actually negate all those effects. So if people start playing more Salamangreat because of the ban list, this deck has an insane matchup against that deck. So yeah, I think we're going to be seeing it a lot more often than we used to, but I still don't think it's going to do as much as people thought it was going to do when it was first released. So I'm putting it at number 7 for now, but the order in any of those lists is very interchangeable, so take this with a grain of salt. All of these decks, even though they're at a certain position right now, in like a few days from now, they can change position depending on participation and all those other decks that are being played, so you cannot really tell exactly in which place all these decks are going to be, so I'm just giving you a skeleton of what you're going to see. Just don't think that these are the absolute best decks when you see them like in different orders, when you see more participation from any other deck. And the representation is always varied depending on the tournament. Number 6, Pure Tri-Brigade. Now, Tri-Brigade, it's not going to be used with Littlesk anymore. You can do it if you want, but the thing is that it lost so much with banning of Simorgh and the limiting of Recital Starling that it's just not worth, in my opinion. At least not if you want to play deck at its most competitive level. So, Pure Tri-Brigade, I think it's where it's at. Zodiacs, again, you can do that, but I think without Trident, it doesn't give you too much of an incentive to do it, just because you want to go first, and without Trident, the engine doesn't really do much going first, and you need to use your normal summon for it as well, because we don't have Barrage anymore either. So the Pure version with Rescue Cat and all those other cards can actually do quite a lot, because Pure Tri-Brigade, only thing it has lost is basically 2 tankies, but that has been the case for quite some time now. It's not that this happened during this list, so the deck is basically the same. It was not using the Simorgh link too much, just because you want to be able to go into cards like Bear Broom and then get to your Revolt. So I think Pure Tri-Brigade, it's not the most explosive deck, but I think it's one of those decks that it's consistent enough, and it does what it wants to do pretty much every single time. So it's a deck that a lot of people choose to play, especially when it comes to tournaments that have a lot of rounds, so they can actually get to play every single game. So this is why this deck, I think, is going to be a really good deck for this format, and it's going to be the deck that people are going to choose for this version of Tri-Brigades, mostly because all the other versions are just too hit by the ban list by this point. Number 5, Prank Kids Adventurer. Now, the Adventurer package, I'm mentioning it now, but keep in mind that you're going to see this in more random stuff. But in Prank Kids, I think the Adventurer Brave Token engine is where it's at, just because this deck does not get hit by the engine's restriction whatsoever. So the restriction of the engine is that you cannot use the effects of your normal summoned monsters. But Prank Kids, all their normal summons, they use their effects in the graveyard. And from that point on, all the monsters you have on the field are special summons. So it's basically like you're using an engine that gets you a free negate on the field before you even do anything, without restricting you from doing absolutely anything. And this is why Prank Kids, I think, are going to become much better, because ever since Meow Moo got limited, this deck kind of lost popularity. But the thing is that it was very susceptible to hand traps, especially during its starting play, because you need to play a lot of other extenders that can sometimes be considered breaks if you don't get hand trapped. So this is why the Adventurer packets can make sure that you don't need to play too many of those fusion spells and maybe multiple copies of the token generator spell card, just because you can use this engine to deal with any hand trap that your opponent throws at you. And if your opponent does not have a hand trap, that means that on top of your full combo that you can do with a single card, that you have a negate on top of it. So I think this deck is going to become much popular because of the Brave Token engine, and I would highly suggest you trying it out again. If you just quit the deck because you thought it was not as good as it used to be, now it's going to be really good. But the problem is that the Adventurer engine is just very expensive, and we kind of saw it coming, because we know that all those OCG engines and things that we see that are doing really well in the OCG, once they are here in the TCG, well, of course, they have all their hype behind them, so the power of the deck is going to be very established, and the prices are going to be really high. But still, this deck is nothing to laugh at, and it's going to make your life difficult if you play against a player that knows what they're doing and they have the cash to get the full engine. Number 4, Invoke Dogmatica Shadow. Again, this deck just doesn't go away. I mean, come on, Konami. Tuna Deer, is that going to do anything? Probably it will do something, but it's not going to be the end-all be-all of the deck. The deck is just too good. Winda is still a thing. We have 3 Meltdown. We have 3 Alistair. The deck is pretty much full power, pretty much. Yeah, you just lost 1 Nadir. But if you're playing less copies than Ecclesia, then now what you're going to do is going to max out Ecclesia. So, problem solved right there. This deck is just too good. The effect to be able to go into Winda, which basically shuts down like 9% of the matchups, especially in a format like this. So, it makes your matchups against most decks very good. Mekaba is a really good card. Have your Dogmatica Punishment, which is arguably the best trap card in the game right now. So, you have so many tools at your disposal. You can play so many hand traps in the deck just because the engines are very small and limited, and you don't really need to play too many cards in the deck in order to make it work. You can even play Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer if you want. This deck just does so much that it's, as long as it doesn't get hit seriously by the ban list, it's always going to be here as one of those anti-meta type of strategies that can summon Winda and do a lot more. Number 3, Eldritch. Now, Eldritch. I'm sure a lot of people are already preparing this deck, playing the tournaments, just because of the third copy of Skill Drain. 3 copies of Skill Drain just means that you can do so much with the deck, or basically means that your opponent is not going to be able to do so much with their deck. Just because, yes, you did lose Imperial Order, but come on, I'm pretty sure anyone would have traded a copy of Imperial Order for 2 more copies of Skill Drain, because Imperial Order, let's be honest, it was a good card, but only good going first. Skill Drain can be used to break boards, especially when combined with cards like Torrential Tribute, Needle Sealing, Solemn Strike, and all those cards. This deck just got so much better, and the deck has never been properly hit by the ban list, because Eldritch was just one of those decks that we thought was going to be really good, but was actually never as good as we thought. But now, I'm pretty sure we're going to see it, because we all know how Yu-Gi-Oh players love their stun decks, so even though we've been seeing True Draco in the past for so long, until Card of Demise went to 1, and all those other cards got hit as well, now Eldritch is basically going to replace that, so that sweet spot in everyone's heart, because they just love not letting your opponent play, and Eldritch with 3 skill drains, it's going to do just that. So you need to be prepared for this deck. Maybe even maining backer removal is going to be a good idea for this format just because of 3 skill drain. We'll have to wait and see, but I guarantee you that we're going to see this deck much more often than we did in the previous formats. Number 2, Enforcer, Adventurer, Phantom Knights. Now, what a title of a deck we have here. This is a deck that has basically come with the full hype from the OCG, but I would take this with a grain of salt. Don't think that this deck is going to be as dominant as it was in the OCG for various reasons, but I still think it's going to be really good, which is why I'm putting it at number 2. But the thing is that we have 1 less copy of Fusion Destiny, which is fine. It's not going to do that much because this deck can summon Anaconda like nobody's business. This deck just spams a lot and it doesn't even care about the restriction. And the Adventure package means that you're not going to lose to hand traps. And also the Adventure package is really good in this deck because Water Enchantress is actually a level 3 extender that you can summon on the field for free, especially if you draw multiple copies with 3 copies of Aramezir and 3 copies of Water Enchantress. So you can actually go into Cherubini with her and you make her the extender that you cut from the deck in order to play this huge package in the deck, which is why I think Phantom Knights, they're just a deck that can do a lot with right hand. The problem with this deck is that it needs to play so many bricks in order to make it work, which is why I'm skeptical on if it is actually going to do as well as it did the OCG, because TCG players value consistency over anything else. I've seen people not play other decks that were supposed to be really good just because of the amount of bricks they had to play in the deck to make it work. So I think that we have to wait to exactly see if people actually choose to play this deck because of the amount of bricks you have played, because you have to play 3 bricks for the Adventure package, you have to play 2 bricks for the Enforcer package, and Phantom Knights have some bricks on their own. Some cards like Ragged Gloves or other cards, they're not exactly the cards you want to see in your hand, so I just have to wait for this deck to be exactly sure, which is why I'm not putting it at number 1, because I'm sure a lot of people would just rush exactly and say that this deck would be even tier 0.5 above anything else that I just mentioned, which I don't think it's the case, just because the only reason they're saying that is because of how well it did in the OCG, but the TCG is very different, so calm down, we'll have to let the format unfold a little bit and see exactly how this deck does, but again, it's still going to be a really great deck, which is why I'm putting it at number 2. But for the number 1 spot, I have to give it to Sword Soul Tenny. Now, this deck, yes, it did lose 2 copies of Desire and Protoss, but I just don't think it makes a difference, because Protoss, yes, was the free win card that it was using against some matchups, especially against Phantom Knights, because you would just call Dark and your opponent would not be able to play, but Sword Soul is one of those decks that is just so consistent and so powerful. It's a mid-ranged combo deck that can actually do a lot. It doesn't lose to Droplet or Dark Ruler no more, because it does have a trap card as well in its disposal, so it's not like one of those full combo decks that just, if it gets Dark Rulered on the entire field, then you can't do anything. So I think this deck can play around a lot, and also being able to have all those extenders, all those starters, it's really good going second as well. The Tenny package was unharmed, which is why people think that this deck is actually really good right now, because some people were calling for an Astronaut getting limited. It would have been a good hit, but I feel like that Konami would not have done this already, just because the deck is fairly new. So the Tenny package makes this deck a monster going second, and even going first, it gives you more freedom without even needing to commit your normal summon. So this is one of those decks that I think TCG players, it suits them better than Phantom Knights, just because you don't have to play bricks in your deck. The deck is very consistent, it's very powerful. Maybe the ceiling is a little bit lower than the Phantom Knight deck, but still I feel like the ceiling of the deck is not what drives TCG players to choose their decks for the big events especially, but more of how consistent they are. So that's why I think we're going to see Sword Soul more than Phantom Knight, but again, I could be wrong. We'll just have to wait and see exactly if TCG players are willing to play more bricks in their deck. But for now, I think this deck is just speaks for itself. What it lost from the ban list, it doesn't make that big of a difference. It's going to be so good, and you're going to see this deck a lot. So yep, that's the list, guys. I think that this format is going to be more diverse than the previous format, just because not only of the fact that Konami hit a lot of stuff that needed to get hit, but because we got back cards cards that people, especially at the beginning of the format, they're going to experiment with. Cards like Fairy Tale Snow, Destrudo, Astrograph, all those cards, you're going to see some people trying those decks out at the beginning of the format. If they're not as good as people expect, then they're going to drop it, yes, and the format is going to lose variety as it goes, but still, especially for the first few weeks, you're going to see so many different decks, and I think the format is going to be really fun. So yep, that's the video, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and we'll see you next time.